Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and today, Wednesday, August 25th, 2021, we're going to be taking a look at 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators this past week. We'll get to those questions in just a minute, but before we begin, as always, we want to give a special shout out to those joining us live here on Facebook. Those that watch on repeat on our YouTube channel or our Facebook page for SMIE Consulting, thank you for being a part of that community. And also those who take the time to download us each week as part of their podcast listening habits. It's good to be part of your lives each week in our profession of international education, and we look forward to sharing some of our tips and thoughts along the way related to our 3 questions of the week. Those questions are, what's the state of U.S. visa processing abroad? A couple of articles that reflect some worrying trends. We'll look at, are international students protected enough in today's international admissions, international education race that we're all in for students abroad? And finally, what's the best setup for an international office on campus? So we'll talk about those 3 issues and more on our midweek roundup today for Wednesday, August 25th. For those of you who have not been a part of the Roundup family before, we take each of the 3 topics we cover in depth here on the Roundup. We take that from a series of news stories that we see coalescing around a certain topic each week. Usually those topics are covered in depth in our weekly newsletter called All the SMIE News Fit to Share. I always share the link to the most recent edition in the comment section here on the Facebook page, but you can go to smieconsulting.org/subscribe to subscribe to the newsletter, as well as see all of our past editions of that weekly news source. Now, it's a wrap-up of all those top stories we see in both social media and international education, and often where those overlap. So let's get first into the topic today of what the state of U.S. visa processing abroad is. So for those of you who are not aware, U.S. consulates abroad are funded in terms of their staffing for consular officers to do visa processing and the interviews and all of that. They are staffed based on the revenue they generate from their DS-160 application fees for non-immigrant visa appointments. So they're self-funded in many ways. They have minimal budgets that are part of what their operating expenses are, but to be able to staff them in the way that they need to meet the demand for student visas and other immigrant and non-immigrant visas, it's dependent on the volume of visa appointments that they have and visa fees paid by the DS-160 fees. The standard fee is $160, but some locations have additional fees that they levy to help support their services that they provide. Now, the challenge is, for those of you who can do math, you realize in the last year and a half of the pandemic, visas had come to almost a standstill. Certainly in 2020 they did. 2021 we saw some reopening happen more broadly by April, May this year. But the challenge is they're funded based on the revenue that they've generated from visa appointments that have come in. So the challenge has been in our consulates and embassies as they've reopened is really getting there, not only being able to open amidst pandemic's effect on other communities much differently than it has here at home, in more severe ways in certain countries, certain restrictions preventing consulates to be reopened fully in our key locations around the world, not opening until May for China and mostly not till June for most of India. So there's some real challenges that have emerged in the last, just in the last 6 months in terms of our ability of U.S. consulates to fully reopen. There's been some leaked internal memos that have popped up, and this article that we're referencing today is one that comes from Foreign Policy magazine and journal. Really, they refer to several leaked memos and cables that point to a drastic restriction in finances that the Bureau, in the Bureau of Consular Affairs, that will lead to reduced services until at least 2022. So perhaps even 2023. So it has resulted the lack of finances because, again, of just generated visa fees, because they weren't processing visa applications for so long. You now have a backlog of more than 500,000 immigrant visa applications and millions for non-immigrant visas, including student visas. Majority of those are probably tourist visas and business visas. Moreover, this is also on top of the Trump era, where there were 400 employees that quit or retired. Many of them were visa officers, which do tend to be the entry-level pieces. So a lot of folks that might have joined foreign service maybe during the Trump administration and had just really some horrible experiences and have left. And there's even a survey now, according to a recent survey of State Department staff, that says even now 1 in 3 State Department staff are looking to leave their posts. So there's been a lot of turnover, and those bodies can't be replaced quickly enough to get the consular officers needed to staff visa appointments back to normal levels. So it's really a challenge. And I mentioned earlier that these consular officers tend to be the ones who are doing the visa interviews. That's usually your first assignment overseas, is you spend your time in front of visa windows interviewing prospective visa applicants, non-immigrant and immigrant alike. So there are some real challenges, and though the greater majority of consulates have reopened, we've seen some stories in certain countries where they've not. Some of that's down to local staffing. Some of that is down to local restrictions that they don't have the staff fully to do the visa interviews. So there's some real logistical challenges currently that the State Department faces that are frankly of their own making. That the way that these positions are funded is through a mechanism that they've set up or have had to set up over the years. I don't know the full history of that in terms of how consular officers have been funded before the DS-160 fees have been used to pay for them to be hired locally. So what is really troubling is the knock-on effect the pandemic is going to have on visa processing. So when we see our country opening to more of normal in terms of in-person education for campuses this fall, the majority are planning in-person or slightly modified hybrid versions this fall because of the rise of Delta. They're not completely going online like they did last fall. So there's more of a normalcy there, but certainly campus is anything but, with now challenges of visa or vaccinations required. That will also impact international students, and depending on how they're implemented. So we have a lot of things that go into the challenging dynamics of running campus communities when many who have been trying to come for the last year and a half, some still aren't able to get in because they aren't able to access visa appointments in a timely manner to be able to get here in time for in-person studies this fall, that they're maybe deferring again to the spring, or worse yet, maybe giving up completely, maybe having an opportunity to go online if campuses have made that option available again. Not everybody has, and they put themselves in slightly awkward situations with what do you do with these students who want to begin? Been waiting for some of them up to a year and a half to start their studies, haven't been able to in person. Now there's at least another semester where they might not be able to do that. So what does that mean for you and your campuses, and how you'll respond to their needs? So this article by Foreign Policy also goes into some of the history on how State Department consulates, how the State Department managed consular affairs officers, and that it's really the challenge of resources but providing the services that are needed to support entry of those non-immigrant and immigrant communities that are looking to come from abroad to the U.S. So this is something that Visas were actually not issued as part of border control until World War I. And that was formalized in the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, according to this article. And the challenge has been in 2019, before the pandemic really hit travel, Consular Affairs issued nearly 10 million non-immigrant visas and visa applications. Officers were expected to interview in many locations 120 applicants per day. So that's that. And your first experience as a Foreign Service officer abroad is as a visa officer, and that's 120 interviews that you're doing every day. So that's tough work. It's a rush system. The visa interviews in 5 minutes or less, conducted through bulletproof glass, often in a language other than English. Particularly for a lot of the non-immigrant visas, like that are for visitor visas, that type of thing. So during that 5-minute interval, the officers must also complete security and criminal checks. System is well beyond what was envisioned back in 1924 and in 1952 when the Bureau of Consular Affairs was created. So it's a really good history piece as well, I think, for all international education officials, particularly those on the international admissions on ISSS sides. Certainly you'll find out probably a lot of things in there that you didn't know about visa processing overseas. So useful article, and though we've seen some pop-ups, some news stories about how many visas have been issued in China since May, and there's another one we'll be sharing next week about the visas issued, U.S. visas issued to Indians has hit a record number this year already, ahead of pre-pandemic levels. We'll be sharing that story in the newsletter next week. So though there are some bright spots, clearly as a system, there's some real challenges here. And in terms of what that means for international educators, there's still quite a bit that needs to be done to get us back to where we need to be pre-pandemic in terms of our ability to bring in those students that we've been so eagerly awaiting to come to campus for the last year and a half. So more on that topic, I'm sure, in the weeks to come. Next, we turn to a question that has always been there in the back of our minds as international educators, that when we hear the horror stories of how some students' journeys to the U.S. began, what they might have had to go through either in their personal lives or in their just the process of applying to the United States through educational agents or other services. So there's some real harrowing experiences that exist, and you hear those horror stories, and you always think to yourself, are international students protected enough? And that's something that it's our second question this week, but it's a topic that it's always there, I think, for international educators, particularly those on the front end of the recruitment process. But it's an article this past week from the Walrus in our Canadian publication. It's called The Shadowy Business of International Education. Foreign students are lied to and exploited on every front. They're also propping up higher education as we know it. So that's kind of the tagline for the article. So the story begins, and I really encourage all of us to take a look, and it's probably a good 5-minute read, but it's an article that focuses on the story of one student, Kushandeep Singh from Punjab in northern India, that basically his family are farmers, and he lives in a ramshackle house below grade that gets flooded often during the rainy season. They are their family owns a 12-acre plot of land with wheat, rice, a few cows, and buffalo. And this from the article, it talks about his life growing up. That the family, and the line of this paragraph here, the family's biggest investment by far was Kushandeep. Most of the kids in his school, in his village, learned while sitting on the floor of the local government school. But Kushandeep's father insisted on sending him to the nearest city, Patiala, to attend a private school with basketball courts, cricket pitch, and instruction in English. And the quote from Kushandip was, "My father never compromised on my education. Tuition alone cost almost a third of the family's income." And that's for his schooling before university. So this is a story of the family doing everything they can to educate Kushandip and prepare him for study abroad. So this is a story when he was ending his secondary school in in India. The article says, a new product began to appear: post-secondary education in Canada. So this is, he was born in 1999, so that shares you a little bit on what the timing we're talking about here. So this was basically Canada's first started exploring India as a market well over a decade ago, but it's become the market for Canada. Their number one market is India. Canadian, in the article here, a student in India who was preparing to study overseas, when he spoke with the author, Canadian education is being sold like hotcakes. You don't even have to sell it. People will just come and buy it. So Canada has really established itself in India, and particularly in Punjab, where a solid number of students that come to Canada are coming from, is from Punjab. So this is the interesting dilemma of how that these families see their education for their sons and daughters, post-secondary education in particular, to be focused abroad, and that families are committing all their resources as much as they can to make it happen. So what happens, the nature of this story is why Canada has become so attractive, because they make it a very straightforward process for study to work to residency, that you can have your immigrant dream there, much like the U.S. has always had the American dream has been something that's attracted immigrants from around the world for decades, for centuries. And that's something that still is, and Canada has its own version of that now in terms of, and making it very clear the pathway for those that are looking to come abroad, that if they come to study, even in a vocational program for 2-3 years, they can have a study to work to residency pathway very clearly laid out for them, at least from the front end. So the story goes into depth into Kushandip's experience, and they generally go to community colleges, the vocational colleges I was mentioning, because that's that quickest path to residency. Some will do their bachelor's degree in the U.S. and come to do one of those vocational programs or a one-year master's program. It's a fairly detailed article and goes into in Canada's perspective, the international students are considered, as the article points out, the product of a system that has blurred the lines between immigration and education in an unofficial ad hoc arrangement meant to appeal to potential immigrants while avoiding any responsibility for their settlement. So this is, and it talks about the dependence of post-secondary institutions on these international students for their fee structures. And it talks about the shadowy world of education agents who deliver them. So this is something that Kushandip's story, he went to an educational agent and he said, these salespeople are not difficult to track down in India. You could find an agent shop on every corner, every street, and every road, says Kushandip. One agent I spoke with put their numbers in the tens of thousands in India alone, though there's no way to know the exact figure. It's, as it is, largely an unregulated business in India. So agents schools aren't often forthcoming about their commissions, according to the article, but multiple agents told me their industry standard is 15 to 20% of a student's first year tuition, a rate that can net them anywhere from $1,500 to $5,000 per head. So that's the commissions the institutions are willing to pay, since it would be recouped by an international tuition close to 5 times higher than domestic fees in Canada. So the article says, today attracting overseas students is a financial imperative. And again, this is a Canadian perspective on this story about the shadowy world of international education. But interestingly, one of the major show you how significant international students are to higher education in Canada. Today, international students are responsible for almost 40% of all tuition fees across Canada. So that's a significant chunk of the pie for operating expenses for these universities, and these institutions are having to do everything they can to make sure that their survival as an institution is continually guaranteed. So international students are propping them up, and there's certainly a lot of truth to that in a lot of these, particularly the vocational education sector in Canada. So we're looking at this story, and he talks about what the agents do. That agents are the kind of the worst stories we've heard about. Agents double charging, taking money from students as consultants and then taking commission from the institutions, falsifying grades, faking English proficiency tests, anything to get the kids into a Canadian school, apparently. So they want, and they talk about the numbers of international students that are coming to Canada, and that the promise of the study to work to residency is one that is significantly appealing to the Indian market. We've talked about that here on the Roundup before, about how valuable it is as a marketing tool to have that clearly defined pathway to a country where that is hypersensitive to work opportunity as part of their reasoning for going abroad, whether it's study or direct employment. That really drives a lot of interest. And those markets that can do it well and that can consistently deliver on their promises of that pathway to permanent residency via study and work are going to come out ahead. And that's where you see a lot of interest driving to the markets that can promise that. So there's some really interesting lines here of that are discussed in terms of what is I don't know if it's a system under incredible pressure that these agents overseas will continually push that, and not necessarily always acting in the student's best interests. And that's the one of those challenging pieces that can really is something as institutions we have responsibilities in doing our due diligence to vet agents before we sign up with them, knowing what kind of training they have, what kind of accreditation they have, other references from other institutions they're already working with to see if they're delivering on the promise of quality students. So there's a lot that goes into these discussions, and I think that and the thought that's put behind it for particularly institutions that are just starting out, it's really important to spend the time on the front end so that that when you're choosing the right folks to deal with these agents abroad, that you are not just accepting every offer that comes your way, but actually spending some time evaluating them, and in the evaluation process, checking references, paying attention to outcomes at other institutions for their students. Are these the kind that come in and are you get them the right 20s? They come into the country on your documents and then transfer out automatically before they actually enroll. Those are agents that are probably less than honest in terms of if they're the ones driving that kind of traffic that are constantly transferring out before they begin studies with you. the ones that send students whose bank documents are faked or whose test scores are faked, whatever it might be, those things, if you have students and all of a sudden come to campus and they can't function in the classroom or they can't pay their bills, which isn't exactly an uncommon occurrence, but for international students, these are the things, depending on their sources, is holding yourself accountable for the students you're bringing in, admitting, but also you need to hold your agents accountable if they are continually bringing in a stream of students that are failing or are not coming in with adequate funding. So it's a double-edged sword. Certainly, it has its benefits, but it does. The use of agents in the way that's described with this article, there are those horror stories that you got to be prepared for and have an action plan in place to deal with. If you aren't doing the vetting on the front end, certainly on the back end, if you're inheriting a system of agents, certainly updating training and those types of things, expectations, making very clear on what those are. When you're paying out the commissions that you're paying out for these students, you certainly need to protect your investment, so to speak. And that's something, because it's your institution's reputation, it's your reputation as an international educator, it's the students that you're bringing in and the experiences they have. If they're not positive ones, they end up failing or going home early because they can't cut it. What does that mean for you, and what their student experience will be, and how that will be related to their friends and family back home? So a lot of murky waters here. Certainly not a lot of new stories coming out of it, but certainly not refreshing, but certainly makes it clear that it's not just a U.S. issue. The issue of the unscrupulous agents is one that impacts students worldwide. But it's something that we need to be thinking about more broadly, and certainly if we're moving towards an international education strategy in the United States, we should be including pieces on protections for our international students throughout the journey, not just once they arrive and they're directly in our care as institutions, but really from the front end in terms of who we're interacting with abroad to get in front of these students. That's something we need to take particular attention to in how we're constructing our own policies on campus and as a country. So I do want to shift gears to our final question, and this comes actually from a NAFSA RAMA, Recruitment Admissions Marketing Network group that NAFSA has. So this story is actually an initial question that was posed by one of my colleagues, Jim Crawley from Hope College. And the conversations that have developed out of that are very interesting, and I bring it up today as kind of one of those questions that is something we want to think about as international educators in what makes the best environment for us to operate in. So my question is, what's the best setup for an international office on campus? And in terms of the way Jim's question was, is what office owns international recruitment on your campus and why? Because he's in a situation at Hope where is it in the admissions office? Particularly, he's talking about international recruitment, and obviously where his particular piece of the puzzle for international. His title is Director of Global Recruitment. He is, I think, at this point has a direct line to either the provost or the president, but that is changing. That his office might be shifting under admissions, regular admissions, as a unit there. There's a separate Center for Global Engagement that manages the international students and study abroad and partnerships and such. And that's what he sees as the potential other option for him. So some of the questions, the responses to this question have related to the size of the campus. That much large, I think many of the responses have said at smaller institutions that they don't, like this one in particular, Walsh University, a smaller institution, under 2,000 undergraduates, 135 of those are international. He works in an admissions office, and he has responsibilities for international recruitment within that. So they handle, or he handles it in the admissions office. That's for all admissions, not just international. Handle recruitment, partnerships, marketing, application processing, I-20s, SDSOs, travel, budgeting, and much more. Some of his colleagues also that do international also have a domestic territory, are in charge of global nomads, the dual citizens that or U.S. permanent residents abroad. So they're at that college with 135 internationals. Their ISSS office is a one-person office. And study abroad has 2 individuals with a variety of other non-international responsibilities. So marketing office does not do international marketing unless it comes from the person's office who does from within admissions, and they are outsourcing some of their international marketing. The person who's responding from Walsh has said his preference would be to operate within an international office where it would be all under one roof for international admissions recruitment, for current international students, study abroad, and all of that. So the pitfalls, he calls it, of working in international for a smaller institution is that you're mostly alone and have to rely heavily on the network outside your institution for ideas, advice, and support. So he ends on the point, his conclusion is, I don't think many smaller institutions in the U.S. are investing heavily enough in international recruitment to have any meaningful impact on overall enrollment, unlike our Western colleagues, where institutional enrollments make up a far larger percentage of overall enrollments. So I think it's really interesting here that he wants to continue this dialogue as well. So I think it's a good conversation starter. Another institution, Florida Atlantic. The Center of Global Engagement is involved in international recruitment but doesn't process applications. So it's a little bit larger institution there, public institution. No, it's not a public institution. Handle in-house foreign credential evaluation for post-secondary coursework. Leads generated through the International Recruitment Office are processed through the Office of Admissions. So that's separate. Because they don't have a separate international admissions office, it's all one office with few individuals who handle international student admission reviews. Okay, so the admissions, once they're admitted, and visa document issuance is done through the International Office, Center for Global Engagement. Not ideal, but it's what worked for us. So that's another perspective on that. Kara Johnson at Governor State University in Illinois, that has one office that handles all things international, including recruitment, admissions, immigration advising, study abroad, partnerships, programming. International population about 130, but growing. 5 staff, director, assistant director, international student advisor, 2 foreign credential evaluators, plus a GA and several student workers. So that's interesting. She started at Governor State and reported to the provost, weren't part of any division. A few years ago, moved under the associate VP for enrollment management, and talking with her boss, that staff within enrollment management had to step in and assist because of fall application numbers, all hands on deck, that type of thing. Size of institution, she admits, also matters here. Some other responses, Northern Illinois, international admissions is a standalone unit, but at the same time is part of a couple divisions, so both in international affairs and the graduate school, because they oversee graduate admissions. So that's interesting to see that. But it's certainly a question that I think is one we'll be hearing more of as more institutions see the value in recruiting internationally and are looking for answers as to how to set up their offices on campus. So that's a very important question, and that can morph over time depending on your operations, and probably should, depending on how you start. So that's all we have for you today on the Roundup. It's a pleasure being a part of your discussions each week on international education, and look forward to moving forward into September and the start of the new school year, and we'll be discussing a lot of the enrollment numbers that will be popping up in the weeks and months to come. So until next time, have a wonderful day. Cheers.